Good morning and welcome back. This is World Talks coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Jastrzębska. US President Donald Trump says an agreement with Iran is set to be signed on Sunday, a move he claims would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But Tehran has pushed back, denying plans for a Sunday signing, criticizing Trump's, and here I quote, unusual insistence on that day, and saying a framework has not yet been finalized. To discuss, I am joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Good morning, Professor. Good to see you again.
Very good morning to you.
So there are discrepancies not only over when this deal or memorandum of understanding might be signed, but also over what it would actually include. The US and Iran seem to be presenting different accounts of its contents and priorities. Can you help us understand those differences and what they tell us about the state of the negotiations?
Even if this first stage, and it's just a first stage, framework deal is signed today, the United States and Iran are saying very different things about the key terms. I'm just going to list a few. First, the Strait of Hormuz, this vital waterway that Iran controls. Iran says that under the framework deal, it will be part of the management, the oversight of the Strait of Hormuz as it is reopened to shipping. The United States is not going that far. Secondly, Iran says that in return for a deal in the Strait of Hormuz, it will get a gradual lifting of U.S. sanctions and an unfreezing of billions of dollars. The figure $24 billion is being used in its assets around the world. The United States says no, that there will only be a lifting of sanctions and an unfreezing of assets once all other arrangements in the first stage are completed. The question of the lifting of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports, similarly, the Iranians say it'll be lifted immediately. The Americans say no, there has to be performance-based. In other words, Iran has to fulfill certain conditions before that occurs. And then if you talk about Iran's nuclear program, Iran says that this is a matter for the second stage of the talks, that limits on its nuclear program are not in this first stage agreement. The Americans insist no, Iran is actually making major concessions in limiting its nuclear program. All of that is unclear, and I'll add one other thing as well. Iran says that under this framework, there is a ceasefire on all fronts. Israel is, at this point, refusing to end its attacks across southern Lebanon, and indeed continued them last night.
Right, so if the memorandum is ultimately signed, what would materially change on the ground? I mean, beyond reopening the Strait of Hormuz, what would be the immediate economic, military, and diplomatic consequences for Iran and the rest?
Well, I think for Iran, that's, this is a key question right now. And, the reason why the Iranians are really going for this framework deal is not just to halt, for good, the American attacks on them and the Israeli attacks. This is an Iranian proposal which from the start said Iran will get economic benefits to begin to rebuild from the war damage. Tens of billions of dollars in the unfreezing of assets. Iran is asking for $300 billion in reconstruction funds. The Americans insist none of that money is immediately available. In terms of the global economy, beyond Iran, I think the Trump administration is banking on a feel-good effect, even if the framework deal is vague, in that you will have a decrease in oil prices, which of course will decrease gasoline prices in the United States, which, to be honest, is perhaps the Trump folks' main priority right now, is the domestic front a few months before the midterm congressional elections.
So let's go over some of these issues in more detail. Now, the nuclear question appears to be deferred into a second phase of negotiations. Now, if Iran insists on retaining this diluted uranium while the United States seeks eventual dismantling and removal of enriched stockpiles, or what, as they call it, nuclear dust, is this simply postponing the hardest issue, or does it create a viable pathway towards a more comprehensive agreement in the future, let's say?
I mean, there is a viable path in terms of the nuclear arrangements, which are quite similar to that in the 2015 nuclear deal that Donald Trump ripped up. And that is, Iran is saying it's 60% uranium. which it developed after Trump left the nuclear deal. This is uranium which could be further enriched to military grade. And Iran is saying, no, we will now dilute it, as you say. The technical term is downblending to 20%, maybe even lower, to the 3.67% of the 2015 agreement. And Iran is saying we will accept supervision of this process, international supervision of the process. If the Americans insist that Iran has to shut its civilian nuclear program entirely, I think that's a non-starter for Tehran. I think that would be a surrender after all the damage is taken during the war. So no, I do expect at some stage, but are we talking weeks, months from now, that the discussions will center on a dilution of the uranium within Iran under international supervision? I just don't know at what point the Trump administration will accept that.
Now, one of the most debated elements of the reported framework concerns Iran's frozen assets, as you've mentioned. So various reports reference approximately $24 billion in Iranian funds, with suggestions that part could be released early and the remainder during the negotiation period, while U.S. officials insist any release would be conditional of Iranian compliance. So what is the most credible understanding of this asset release mechanism, and how significant is this issue for Tehran?
Well, there have been assets released for Iran in recent years. There was an unfreezing of, I believe, around $6 billion of its assets in South Korea during the Biden administration as part of negotiations. So it can occur, and indeed, I think Iran is already making preparations for this to be activated. There was a very interesting report that most of the media missed yesterday, and that is that the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, are said to have unfrozen or will be unfreezing up to $10 billion of Iranian assets, $3 billion of which supposedly had already been received by the Iranians. Now, we need that report to be corroborated, but if that is the case, it indicates that arrangements are already being made for the unfreezing of assets in anticipation of this framework deal, even if the United States denies that there will be any release until you have this performance-related outcome, whatever that means.
Now, I was wondering how much of the current uncertainty stems from the negotiation process itself. And so to what extent does the U.S. negotiating team possesses the regional expertise and institutional experience that existed during the JCPOA negotiations, and you've mentioned them back in 2015 under Obama, right? So does that affect the quality of any potential agreement reached? I'm talking about the American team. Yeah.
There are several issues here. I think the first here is just that you do point out that with the American team, the only time that you had the Americans and the Iranians in the same city in Islamabad in April, when J.D. Vance, the vice president, headed the team, there was no real expertise in terms of nuclear experts, in terms of even economic experts. Now, since then, you've had these negotiations through mediators, and the Americans, the American government does have nuclear experts. It does have economic experts who hopefully are providing input on this. But this raises a second problem, and that is you're not getting these negotiations as you did leading up to the 2015 agreement with the teams in the same building, at least, if not face-to-face. This is being communicated at distance, and that leads to the third problem, that you don't have security around the details of the negotiations. What happens is that someone like a Donald Trump goes onto social media and, as he just did, declares, the agreement will be signed on Sunday. And then an American official says it'll be signed in Geneva. And because this hasn't been coordinated with the Iranians or with the mediators, you have all types of rumors and unconfirmed information flying about. This has not been a proper diplomatic process to try to get out of this war. It is compounded by the attempt to grab publicity. Part of that is on the Iranian side. They want to spend this framework deal in the best terms possible for them. But most of it is caused by just the chaos of the Trump administration and the way that Donald Trump tries to conduct business.
Let's talk about Lebanon, if we may. Recent renewed Israeli attacks on Lebanese towns Tyre, Nabatea, and this displacement order affecting more than 20 communities show there is no sign of a slowdown despite Iranian assurances that Lebanon would be included in a proposed agreement. So what happens to Lebanon if this memorandum moves forward?
There's going to be an Israeli occupation of part of southern Lebanon. It's just a question of how much territory Israel, in effect, grabs before it is finally forced to stop its operations. That's why, even as we talk about this possible framework deal, the Israelis are stepping up operations in southern Lebanon. As you mentioned, in fact, there's 24 towns and villages that were forced to evacuate yesterday. The Israeli Security Cabinet is meeting on Sunday night, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu. We don't know at this point whether they'll be discussing a framework deal that has already been announced or one that is anticipated in the next few days. But I think Israel has shown what it is trying to do, and that is, while it has a nominal ceasefire agreement with the government of Lebanon, using the line that it is pushing back Hezbollah, it will take this strategic territory at least 10 kilometers inside Lebanon and possibly well beyond that so-called yellow line.
Now, throughout this conflict, there have been several signs of tension between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. On multiple occasions, Trump publicly urged Israel to stop military operations and warned against actions that could derail ceasefire efforts and so on. Yet Israeli operations often appear to continue regardless. So what does this tell us about the current state of Trump-Netanyahu relationship?
It tells you that Donald Trump's ego and his desire for a deal trumps, forgive the pun, that relationship with Netanyahu. And that is that, since the Americans halted their attacks on Iran, and remember, Israel was part of those attacks, especially the targeted assassinations, there has been a line against the Israelis certainly attacking Iran while the talks go on, and that has extended or could extend to Lebanon because the Iranians have said we have to have a ceasefire on all fronts. A week ago, Israel crossed the line that Trump had set when it attacked Beirut. The Iranians responded with missile fire on Israel. Israel responded with missile fire on Iran. And Trump got back on the phone with Netanyahu and said, stop attacking Beirut. So I think that's the American line. I think we shouldn't overestimate this, however. I think as long as the Israelis don't attack Beirut, they still have a relatively free hand in southern Lebanon, all the way up to the point that this framework deal is announced. We're not talking about Donald Trump controlling Benjamin Netanyahu or Benjamin Netanyahu certainly controlling Donald Trump. We're talking about two different men and their governments who have different interests, who are linked. They are both linked in the idea that they want to get something out of this against Iran, but sometimes they'll test each other because of how much they want to get for their individual interest.
Scott Lucas, thank you so very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you. Much appreciated.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.